Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, User Experience to Drive Conversion. My name is Emma and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. The webinar will last for approximately 45 minutes. All attendees are on mute, so the only voices you should hear throughout the webinar will be mine and the presenters. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect these and address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the session. You'll receive a follow-up email within the next couple of days with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. I'd now like to introduce Matt Oxley, Director and Founder of the digital agency DotLabel, who will be presenting today's webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Emma. That's right. My name is Matt Oxley, founding partner at DotLabel. We're a specialist user experience digital agency based in what we believe is the new digital mecca of Basingstoke, Hampshire. In today's webinar, I'll be talking about the value of user experience and how we applied that methodology to a recent project we did for the charity Anthony Nolan. Apologies in advance, I'm just getting over a bit of a cough, so if I go on to mute, it's so I'm just having a bit of a coughing fit in the background, so apologies there. Just a quick intro into who we are. We are a user-centric agency, so essentially what we do is we put the user at the center of everything we do. We apply that good user experience principles through all the services we provide, from strategy, through the insights, into the creative build, development and ongoing support. Over the last 10 years or so, we've applied that methodology across a broad range of clients and digital projects. Our vast experience across that range of sectors really allows us to bring new ideas and insights into every project that we work on. But ultimately, what makes a great user experience? User experience encompasses really all aspects of the user's interaction with a company, whether it's its services or its products. Great user experience is about making every experience as effortless and as pleasurable as possible. It's not solely digital, it encompasses every touch point that the business has with that user across every process. But ultimately, how do we create a great user experience? The key to this is understanding your users. I mean, this sounds obvious, but one of the biggest challenges, I guess, when we start talking to companies is obviously they believe they understand their users, and that's understandable. You know, you've been selling a product or a service to them for years. You know them better than anybody. The challenge is their online behavior can be so different to their offline behavior. There's so many other factors that are involved in determining their online experience with you. So how do we go about understanding your users? First of all, we identify who they are, what it is they're trying to achieve, how are they going to achieve that, and whereabouts are they when they're trying to do this. Out of the back of that, we develop personas, goals, tasks, and scenarios. By truly understanding your users and their expectations and goals is key to success of any online project. By defining those goals, mapping those tasks and scenarios, you can effectively create a fantastic custom experience for a whole range of user journeys designed specifically to drive better results for your digital solution. How we go about that, there's essentially four key pillars of research. There's the stakeholder insight, obviously the user insight. There's the expert evaluation and competitive benchmarking, so that's where the expertise of a good user experience agency or designer would bring. And then looking at the analytical data, the analytics that sit underneath your existing platforms. All digital projects should encompass research. It's just like you would with any new product you're launching. Digital experience is just the same. In an ideal world, your research would encompass all four aspects of this. But in the real world, we understand that's not always the case. You know, you should look at trying to take as much from each of those four sources as possible. but I'd obviously avoid not relying on one source for that research, as it will heavily bias your insight. So the key to all this is having a flexible user experience methodology. We've sort of broken it down into these key phases. Some of these you'll be familiar with. But there's a number of tools and activities that we can do to achieving a great user-centric solution. As we said, the key is to be flexible. Every project is different, and you need to adapt to meet your project parameters, whether that's budget, timescales, access to the users and stakeholders. But the single most important goal of any user experience is ensuring that we meet and exceed your users' expectations. So why is this? By doing so, we provide a more enjoyable, positive experience. Think about it. Users have an expectation of what needs to be done when they're trying to achieve something. So whether that's online banking, purchasing something online, they have an expectation of what's involved. If you can provide a better experience than that and meet and exceed their experiences, they will come back and do it again. They'll have positive associations with your brand, as well as sharing that experience with their friends and family. But it's not all about giving your users what they want. We have to align those users' needs with obviously the business goals. And by truly understanding both the users' needs and the business goals, we found that you will drive much more effective, better results for your project. So, obviously, we applied a lot of this methodology and approach to a project we did for Anthony Nolan. For those who don't know about the charity, it's a fantastic charity. They do some amazing work around saving the lives of people with blood cancer. They do a lot of work around matching incredible individuals who are sort of willing to donate their blood stem cells or bone marrow to people who desperately need life-saving transplants. They also educate young people about the life-saving difference that they can make by joining the register. They also do a lot of groundbreaking research around improving the success rates of transplants, and they do so much more around caring and looking after people through that process as well. So it's a fantastic cause. The main challenge for Anthony Nolan is finding and matching patients with their donors. One of their key tools for achieving this is their online donor register. So it's imperative to Anthony Nolan that we create a simple yet positive experience around that whole registration process. So we were engaged with Anthony Nolan to look at how we can improve that whole online donor registration process. But it was key to note that it wasn't simply looking at creating a new online form. It was more a new way of looking at engaging with their supporters whilst educating them about joining the register and encouraging those that were eligible to then sign up. It wasn't just about getting more people to sign up. We broke the goals down into sort of three main areas. Education was the first one. We needed to make sure that every person who made the commitment to join the register understood what they were signing up for. I don't know if anyone here is listening has signed on the register with Anthony Nolan, but when you sign up, you're making a commitment for up to sort of 60 or so years. So it's vitally important that you know why you're doing it, what's involved. It's really a rare thing to find a tissue match. So when Anthony Nolan do find one, they need to be sure that the donor will follow through with their commitment. The worst thing for Anthony Nolan is if in 10 years' time they ring up a donor and ask them to come in and donate a bone marrow. The donors obviously forgot they registered. It was 10 years, it was a long time ago. They didn't really understand what was involved when they signed up, and then unfortunately they may back out and refuse to be a donor. And it's obviously a very sad case when that happens. It was also about quality of applicants. The majority of successful applicants through the online registration were predominantly young white females. Unfortunately, there was such a poor response from young males, particularly from black and Asian males. We had to look at how we can make the process more engaging to a very targeted groups. The other part was retention. Essentially, there's two parts to this. It was also about keeping in touch with people who had successfully registered. We need to keep them informed about what Anthony Nolan is doing, reminding them of their commitment, as well as what it means, and also keeping their details up to date. But it was also about managing that engagement with those who weren't eligible to join the register. You know, how do we manage their journey into other ways that they can help the charity? So I put a few slides together just to sort of give you a snapshot of some of the key stages that we went through with Anthony Nolan in the research phase for developing their new online donor recruitment process. So we start with every project. We do an expert analysis of the current system and the current application process. You know, we got some great insight. You know, Anthony Nolan doing a fantastic job in driving lots of donors to the registration form. However, you know, they were faced with, you know, what's a very generic, bland, long-winded, and very overly complicated form that asked a lot of very intimate health questions. The tone of the questions were very impersonal. They were very engaging. And, you know, from a best practice perspective, you know, it didn't meet the minimum bars, really. Call to actions were quite confusing, and things like that. So there was a lot of challenges and opportunity to improve it. There was no particular analytics around this to start to map user flows and drop-offs. However, you know, we knew that the number of applicants that were completing the form was surprisingly very high. I mean, this is brilliant. This really showed that the people who were coming onto the registration form, they were really engaged with the Anthony Nolan cause, and they really wanted to help, which is fantastic. One of the other things that we identified was that, you know, Anthony Nolan had three key qualifying criteria to being on the register. I think they were age, location, like UK-based, height, and weight. Yet this was unclear at the start. Users would find out if they were qualified after they completed the form. So, and those that didn't qualify were presented with a sort of very generic, uninspiring apology page. I mean, you know, this is the point where the users the most engaged with Anthony Nolan. They're really wanting to help and they're wanting to register. Unfortunately, they can't for a number of reasons. But how else can they help? How can we now take them on that journey and see how else they can help Anthony Nolan? We started to map out a very basic view of the current user journey. So we sort of identified that they were coming from multiple sources, whether that was online, digital, Facebook, social, TV campaigns, as well as on-the-ground events at universities and fetes and festivals. Data was being captured online, it was being captured on bits of paper. So we really understood how the user flowed through this and also how the data flowed through the system as well. We then looked into competitor benchmarking. So with benchmarking, we start to explore what other companies and organizations are doing differently and doing better. You know, we particularly, obviously in this case, looked at a very long, complex registration processes. So we looked inside the charity sector as well as outside of that. So we looked at things like features, functionality, looked at how the user journey went through this process, how the content was presented, and obviously the look and feel of these forms. By doing this, we really start to understand the user's expectations, you know, what that they're based on from what that experience that they've been through before in a similar situation. So we take all that initial insights, research that we've done, and then we run a number of stakeholder workshops with Anthony Nolan. The initial stakeholder workshop was all around setting goals and sort of KPIs around the project. What are we trying to achieve here, making sure we were all aligned. We got the stakeholders' views of the existing process. You know, we spoke to the IT teams, the call center staff, we spoke to the marketing team, the donor recruitment team. So we got all that insight into their perception of the existing process. We also talked to them about starting to identify their different user types and get the stakeholder view on those users. Sorry, the picture here is of Mike, who's our UX lead at DotLabel. He's running a card sorting exercise, which is quite a useful UX technique we often use. It really helps us to prioritize content and start to visualize user workflows. And we can do it in a very interactive way, so we can very quickly scratch things around, move things about to start to visualize that workflow. So on the left-hand side, you sort of see the entry points, and on the right-hand side is the sort of desired goals. And in between, we start to explore those paths, identify potential barriers that users might come against, and then how we might overcome those barriers so the user can achieve their desired goals. Within the stakeholder workshop, we ran a persona exercise where we started to identify the different user groups. We look at their perceived users' needs, looked at their wants, expectations, I guess the frustrations and the limitations that each of their users may have when on the online process. We started to flesh out their personal attributes. What are their motivations and goals for signing up? What's the important factors to them? But also, what are the barriers and the frustrations that they're looking at the moment? But more importantly, what are their expectations? So the personas are a fantastic tool. They really help us both in the recruitment process when we come in when we talk later on in the process about user insights and user research. It helps with that recruitment process. But it also starts to help us validate a lot of our initial recommendations, whether that's in the wireframing, whether in the visual design bit. It just really helps always come back to the user personas. If it's of interest, there's quite an interesting blog on our website about the difference of marketing personas and user experience personas, and also the value that they bring as well. Out of the workshops, we define a single focused user goal, which was that the users wanted to help to support Anthony Nolan. And that was key. That was what underpinned everything that we moved forward with. There was a number of secondary goals, obviously signing up to the register. If they can't sign up to the register, what do we do then? Is that raising awareness, raising money? But we had a single focused goal that we were working towards. With this single goal in mind, we started to really flesh out and identify their users' motivations. What is it that's really driving your users to achieve their goal? And from that, we developed a number of outcomes. And they're essentially ways that we can achieve that goal. And what this does is it's almost like the building blocks to building up user scenarios. Here you can see we've started to flesh out those motivations and outcomes. It just starts to capture like the name, the source of where they might be interested in, how they found out about it, the location, the device that they might be working on, and again, their motivation. And again, this really sort of starts to help us flesh out scenarios in a lot more detail. I don't know if anyone's used scenarios before, but these are very descriptive narratives that we use constantly to test against when we're proposing our approach later on. Essentially, in an ideal world, we'd love to recruit all the users that represent those key user groups that we're appealing to and run through those scenarios. However, we appreciate, resource, budgets, user availability to users. That's not always the case. So what these scenarios do, it helps us, DotLabel, it also helps Anthony Nolan to step into those roles and act out those scenarios so we can start to test the wireframes, the workflows that we're proposing. From that earlier card sorting exercise that we did earlier, we start to visualize the user workflow. It's quite a long diagram, so I've sort of broke it down into little bits, but essentially the main green column is the sort of streamlined workflow that we want the user to go through. But as you can see, we can start to map out where the users might be distracted. There might be options, there might be other routes, there might be, okay, they didn't qualify, so where do we take them through? So this in one nice visual diagram really helps us understand those different workflows. We can test that there's no obstacles or distractions, there's no dead ends essentially, and we can start to sort of control that user journey. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the scenarios that we created, we then walked through these workflows. So this is sort of a final iteration of a lot of feedback and tweaks on that. Okay. From the workflows, we then start to develop what's called an interaction map. So this is a more detailed workflow. This is where we start to understand the content, where we understand the call to actions. We sort of explore the taxonomy, essentially the labeling of everything and where everything goes. And what really helps us with this, it really starts to help the developers and the designers, as well as the content producers, really understand the sort of scale and scope of the project. It also saves a lot of time when we're doing the wireframing process later on. So we've created these workflows, these very detailed interaction maps. We then start to visualize the paths and identify the paths that the users are going to take through those workflows to achieve their particular goals. I think in this case we created or identified 26 key user journeys that covered everything from forms completed over a single visit to forms completed over multiple visits, failed registrations, where users had come from, whether they did come from Google or other sources. So we started to really map out those different user journeys. And again, the purpose of this is we record these journeys so we can test our wireframes, our prototypes and our designs against at a later stage. It just ensures that what we're proposing works. All through this process, we're constantly documenting all the insight we're gathering, all the research, all the feedback into a single strategy document. The purpose of this is first of all, it ensures everyone's aligned in what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to approach it. We can constantly refer back if things are getting challenged or questioned at a later stage in the project, we can refer back to this and go, we approach it this way because this user insight informed us on this. And everyone's aligned with that. It was also, as a charity, Anthony Nolan, they're accountable for every penny they spend. So essentially this really helped justify the investment and the value that they were getting back out and the return that they're going to get back out on this. Into some nice visuals. One of the initial challenges we had or identified was around making the whole experience relevant to the end user and therefore making it more engaging to them. In the earlier research, we identified that users were landing, coming to the registration form from various sources, so whether that was TV ads, Facebook campaigns, magazine articles. So we early on identified that it was the content of the source that really initially connected the user with Anthony Nolan. So we wanted to ensure that there was a consistent, seamless experience from that content source point. To sort of visualize this idea, we sort of mocked up some concept screens just to sort of help us and Anthony Nolan explore this idea further. So we took a campaign that Anthony Nolan was doing at the time. This was for Bobby's mum. For those of you who are not the Only Way as Essex fan, apparently he's a big star from there. But it was one of Anthony Nolan's most successful campaigns. They drove massive traffic and interest to Anthony Nolan from this campaign. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a landing page that from whatever source they came from, whether it was TV, they seen Bobby on TV or in an article, that they landed on a page that was consistent with that journey. So, they arrived on a landing page and Bobby was there, for example, just with a simple welcoming message. We wanted to ensure right through that process, the presence of Bobby and the communication was consistent with that. Even explored that, creating videos just as a thank you, as a way of rewarding potential donors and people who are interested in Anthony Nolan's cause and just really sort of giving them a warm welcome and a thank you. By doing this, we were trying to make that whole process more personal, and more relevant to the user, and therefore drive more engagement and encourage users to sign up to the register. We mocked up mobile screens as well to show how we can be consistent and across all the different devices as well. So Anthony Nolan really loved that idea. We thought that actually this sounds fantastic. So what we did is we started to work into the wireframe phase. So we produced a number of static wireframes. We looked at a number of examples of content sources. So in this case, we looked at the Anthony Nolan website. That's an obvious content source to start from. But then we looked at campaigns that they were running for on Gay Times, for example, Match for Lara campaign. So all these different users were engaged with Anthony Nolan for a specific content source, and we wanted to make sure that that was continued. So we mocked up individual landing pages. We wanted to keep it simple, we wanted to keep it focused, but we wanted to keep it relevant. We then moved to producing a number of static wireframes where we explored how the interface would look and work, how the content might be on there, how we can look at educating users as they go through the process, as well as identifying, using this prototype where the drop-off points potentially were, and then how we took them on that journey further. These wireframes we tested against those scenarios and personas that we created earlier, so they were done internally at DotLabel and with Anthony Nolan. Once we refined them, we then built them into a working prototype. Unfortunately, I can't jump off this presentation to sort of take you through the working prototype, but essentially it allows anyone that's not used them before, it just takes these wireframes and adds a layer of interaction. So we can actually click through, we can enter data, we can actually start to map out the process that the user would go through. We obviously map them out on mobile devices as well, so we can make sure that the experience is just as engaging on a mobile and tablet device as well. And again, these were constantly tested against those personas and scenarios that we created earlier. It's just another example of how a form might dynamically adapt depending on a user, the inputs that the user puts in there. So we've created these wireframes, we've created this interactive prototype, we've run them internally, we've tested them against our personas and our scenarios, but what we wanted to do was eliminate any guesswork from this solution. So what we did is we ran a number of user focus groups where we invited our key audience groups into a room, and we then tested that prototype against a number of scenarios that we created. That feedback allowed us to very quickly and cost-effectively tweak the workflows, the content that we were presenting, and obviously the interface. I can't stress enough how much valuable it is to get user insights. It's setting up user research. It's the easiest things to do. It's not the cheapest part of a project, but it had so much value to the project. We learned so much from just talking to the different individuals and getting their feedback on there. Things like millennials, they're more than happy to share their private medical information, which we thought might have been a barrier. We thought this might be a barrier, people entering the different medical information they have. But actually what was a real blocker was they didn't want to share their friends or family's contact details. It's fine for them to share their information, not a problem. Sharing their mum's contact details, they just dropped out of the process. And, from Anthony Nolan's perspective, it's key to capture that information. If we need to get hold of that individual in 10 years' time and they've changed their details, we need a backup to get hold of them. So we had to rethink how we educated those users as they were going through the form of the importance of why we needed this data. Some of the insight that came back was people didn't actually understand what was involved when they were signing up. So again, that really helped with the content strategy of how we educated them as they went through that process. The other bit was about sharing. Again, in a day and age where people share pretty much what they've had for breakfast and everything, what they didn't want to share was that they'd sort of helped Anthony Nolan and worked this, helped their cause. You know, that was an insight that we didn't think that was actually relevant to the millennial age. So we've took all this user insights, we've run through all these scenarios with them, we fed that back into the wireframes and the prototype. We've then gone back through that testing process again to make sure that everything is working fine and as intended. We then presented all that feedback, all the insight that we'd gathered back to the stakeholder team. We went through all that, we went through the results, we identified some of the barriers and other options that were agreed, and then looked at the priorities. So out of the back of this, there was a number of challenges that we didn't foresee at the beginning of the project. Things like some of the data that, or how the data that we wanted to collect was presented. Example is gender. The obvious one is male, female, other. There was hotly debated within the user research about whether other should be included, whether it should be transgender, whether it should be included as other. That was a big discussion, and actually, you know, one of the other challenges we had was that the legacy systems that sat behind this was struggling to actually make any changes there. So there was a lot of things that we needed to do there just for a small point. You know, we didn't want Anthony Nolan to not be seen as inclusive, and everybody is, can be sign up to the register. We then updated the prototype based on the research, and essentially there was a technical specification that the development team knew exactly what they were building up against. So, just to summarize, I guess, some key learnings that we had from that research was that investing in that research was that we didn't have to rely on the assumptions that we had at the initial stage of the project. We thought we understood, and Anthony Nolan understood, who their key users were and what was driving their motivations, but actually there was a lot of things that came out of that we didn't know, and we did apply that to the new registration process. We also proved that the education content throughout the process was working. A lot of work was put into what was it we were trying to educate them and how we were going to go about doing that. And we tested that, and actually that was proved, and that we got some fantastic feedback through that user research. It also proved that our new approach, which was more targeted and more engaging, was working. You know, it was a big step up to take it away from just simply an online form to actually looking at this from outside of the website right through the whole process and making sure we had a consistent journey and content experience. It also allowed us to ensure that everything was tested before it went to this very expensive development phase. As everyone knows, in the developing digital projects, a development project can be quite drawn out if things are not thought out and considered at the very beginning. And the wireframes that we put forward, the interaction maps, they were presented to the technical team. They knew exactly what they were building. They knew exactly the effort that was going to be involved and how they were going to approach that. So I guess that sort of sums up a bit about the Anthony Nolan project that we went through. One of the questions, I obviously skimmed across a lot of the value user experience and some of the approaches and methodologies. A lot of the questions we get asked is about how we set a budget against this. There's a little ebook that we put together that you can find on our website. So if you go to dotlabel.co.uk/web-budget-ebook, you should be able to download that. And it's a great little book. It gives you everything you need to know when planning a new website project, the benefits of user experience approach, plus a few tips on how to save some money and time on a project. If you have any questions, please do fire them through. I'm happy to answer them now. For those that might be viewing this later date, my email's on there. Please feel free to fire me an email, or you can follow us on Twitter at DotLabel, where we share a lot of insights into the whole user experience process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. We're now going to answer some of the questions that have been submitted. So just one's come through. What was the reason for creating several landing pages for each press source? Why didn't you create just one landing page for all scenarios? Yeah,
good question. So one of the things we identified was that that the users were coming from various different sources, whether that was, like I said earlier, TV or a press ad, and the articles that they were, or the source that they were coming from, that's when they were initially engaged with Anthony Nolan. So that was at the point where they were like, right, I really want to help Anthony Nolan with their cause. And so we wanted to make sure that we created a very consistent and seamless journey through that process. So whether that was someone had read an article on Gay Times that they read an article, they saw that they could be on the register, they wanted to be involved, so we knew that they were coming on here from that point, and we knew how to then talk to them that was relevant to that particular source. So same with the Match for Lara, we knew that they were touched by the campaign that Anthony Nolan were running with the Match for Lara campaign, and they wanted to, so we wanted to make sure that we were carrying that experience through. And by doing so, we anticipate that you'll get a much more higher engagement right through that whole process.
Thank you,
I hope that
Matt.
answered the question.
How long did this process take before it went into development?
Oh, good one. So it was about, in total, about 4 months or so, about 4.5 months. And obviously that's not working every day and night on the project. Essentially, there's a few factors in there that affect timescale. So things like, arranging user research sessions. They can be quite depending on availability of users and how we get them together. But it was about sort of 4.5 months.
Thank you, Matt. Someone has asked about your strategy booklet. So are you sharing the booklet that you showed earlier?
This one? The How to Set Your Website Budget, that one. Yes, so please do go on our website. There's I think it's DotLabel.co.uk, web-budget-ebook. I think there's just ask for your email address, and I think you can download the booklet from there. And we've had some great feedback from it, so people are finding it really useful. So, and again, if there's any questions on the back of that, please do fire them along.
Thank you, Matt. We haven't had any further questions, so just to remind you all that you can submit them via the chat box in the control panel. So are you happy, Matt, to just wait a couple of minutes to see if anyone has any other questions?
Yeah, certainly, not a problem.
Yeah, okay, we'll just bear with us, yeah.
I'm guessing if no one's got any questions, it must have answered everything in my presentation.
Yeah, that's correct, Matt. We haven't had any further questions. I'd like to say thank you to Matt for presenting today's webinar, and thank you to everyone for attending. I'm just going to go to the next slide. The topics covered today are included in a new digital diploma in professional marketing level 6. So if you're interested, please contact us for more information. Once you leave the webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. On behalf of CIM and today's presenter, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.